In WWE, every punch in the ring might be scripted. But behind the curtain, where there's no script, no referee, that's where the real conflicts begin to surface. Some blows aren't thrown for titles or for the crowd, but for pride, ego, and tensions that have been building for months, even years. In today's video, Wrestling Sphere takes you inside the real backstage brawls between WWE superstars, where the locker room turns into a battlefield, and every punch leaves a real mark. CM Punk vs. Jungle Boy Jack Perry, when the glass wasn't just a prop. Kicking off this list is a backstage brawl whose shockwaves are still felt to this day, the real-life fight between CM Punk and Jungle Boy Jack Perry, which took place at AEW's All-In event inside London's Wembley Stadium. While it never aired on TV, what happened behind the curtain quickly became one of the hottest topics in the wrestling world, not just because of the names involved, but because it ultimately led to CM Punk's departure from AEW. It all began with something that seemed trivial, a creative idea involving a windshield. Jungle Boy, real name Jack Perry and son of late actor Luke Perry, wanted to include a risky spot in his match where he'd be slammed through the windshield of a car. The catch: it wasn't a breakaway prop made of sugar glass like usual. It was real. And the car? A rented one, which meant damage wouldn't just be his responsibility, but could reflect poorly on the company as a whole. CM Punk, a veteran with years of experience and a deep concern for safety, immediately spoke up. He wasn't just worried about Perry getting hurt, but also about the lack of professionalism and the long-term consequences for AEW. According to Punk, he bluntly told Perry the idea was reckless, irresponsible, and completely unnecessary. At the time, Perry didn't argue, just stayed quiet. But clearly, he didn't forget. Fast forward to the pre-show of All in London, and Jungle Boy went ahead with the windshield stunt anyway. After crashing through the glass, he looked straight into the camera and coldly said, "You know what this is? Real glass." It wasn't a throwaway line, it was a direct shot at CM Punk's earlier warning. Punk saw it, and he didn't let it slide. Backstage, when the two came face to face, the tension was palpable. After a few heated words, Punk walked up to Perry to confront him. Things escalated quickly. No one backed down. And, as is often the case in a world driven by pride and ego, the argument turned physical. In an interview with Ariel Helwani, Punk later said he put Perry in a chokehold to de-escalate the situation. Staff rushed in to separate them, but the damage was already done. Right after the scuffle, Punk returned to the locker room, brushed past AEW president Tony Khan, and delivered a cold remark, "This place is a joke." Then he left the building, went back to his hotel, and made the decision to walk away from AEW entirely. In that same interview, Punk revealed he only went through with his match that night, against Samoa Joe, out of respect for Joe and producer Jerry Lynn. But mentally and emotionally, his trust in AEW was shattered from the moment that fight broke out. The story might have faded over time, if not for one twist. AEW eventually released security camera footage of the altercation. But instead of clearing things up, it backfired. With no audio, the video simply showed Punk restraining Jack Perry, exactly as he described. If AEW had hoped the footage would turn fans against Punk, the move failed. Instead, it seemed to validate Punk's version of events, at least for the time being. As of now, Jack Perry hasn't shared his side of the story. AEW remains silent. Punk has moved on to new chapters. But one thing's for sure, that moment where Perry crashed through the windshield didn't just shatter glass, it tore open an already fragile backstage atmosphere. This wasn't just a personal feud. It was a clear sign of what happens when big egos clash in an environment lacking strong leadership. And it's a reminder that in wrestling, not all fights happen in the ring. Sometimes, the real punches land where there are no cameras, no referees, but consequences that no one can ignore. Chris Jericho vs. Brock Lesnar, when egos collide harder than fists. Setting aside the drama with CM Punk, let's turn our attention to another veteran, Chris Jericho. While he may not have the massive frame of some of his peers, Jericho has never been someone you could push around in a locker room. On the contrary, if someone crossed the line, he had no problem stepping up and making it very clear that he wasn't just all talk. The first major incident dates back to 2003. At the time, Jericho was already an established name in WWE, while Goldberg had just arrived from WCW with a reputation of being an unstoppable beast. But long before that, Tension had been simmering between them since the final years of WCW. Back then, Jericho had tried to pitch a storyline feud with Goldberg, promos, matches, full-on segments. He was ready for it. Goldberg, however, wasn't interested.
Why?
Because, in his eyes, Jericho wasn't on his level. Years passed, but the resentment didn't fade. It eventually boiled over in a WWE locker room. The pressure that had built up finally exploded. According to those who witnessed it, harsh words quickly turned into a full-blown physical altercation. No script, no cameras, just two big egos and a spontaneous brawl. The shocking part, despite being the smaller man, Jericho got the upper hand. Even Goldberg later admitted it during an episode of Jericho's podcast, saying candidly, "You really kicked my ass." But if you think that was a one-off moment proving Jericho's toughness, wait until you hear what happened in 2016, when he went toe-to-toe with none other than Brock Lesnar. At that year's SummerSlam, the main event between Lesnar and Randy Orton ended in chaos. Orton lay unconscious in a pool of blood after Lesnar elbowed him in the head, and won the match by TKO, something unheard of in WWE storytelling. The arena was stunned. Backstage, Jericho was just as shocked. No one had told him that the brutal elbow was planned, and he feared Orton had been seriously hurt. As soon as Lesnar walked through the curtain, Jericho didn't hesitate. He confronted the Beast head-on. Face to face. Neither man backed down. On one side, you had a former UFC champion fueled by instinct. On the other, a fearless legend driven by loyalty and principle. Everyone around tried to separate them but were shoved aside. Jericho later recalled, "I thought, if he hits me, I'll bite his damn nose off. He might kill me, but I won't back down." The standoff only ended when Vince McMahon stormed in, shouting and threatening to fire both of them if they didn't cool off immediately. Chris Jericho isn't someone who picks fights for the sake of it. But if he feels a line has been crossed, whether it's about respect, friendship, or backstage integrity, he won't stay quiet. And that's what makes him one of the rare few in wrestling. Not just a master in the ring, but someone no one dares to mess with behind the scenes. Joey Styles versus John Bradshaw, Layfield, a small commentator, one heavy punch. When it comes to WWE backstage brawls, you probably wouldn't expect one of the most talked about confrontations to involve a commentator. But that's exactly what happened between John Bradshaw Layfield, JBL, and Joey Styles, an incident that's become the stuff of legend. Not because the guy getting punched was a former WWE champion, but because the man who threw the punch had never even stepped into the ring as a wrestler. JBL had long been known for his rough, abrasive personality. For years, he was notorious for teasing, and sometimes outright bullying, new talent. He came up in an era where testing the rookies was considered part of locker room culture. And during WWE's annual tribute to the troops tour in Iraq, JBL once again fell into his old habits. This time, his target was ECW commentator Joey Styles. Throughout the long flight and in the days leading up to the show, JBL kept poking, mocking, and provoking Joey in front of others. But unlike many who stayed quiet, Joey eventually had enough. In a backstage blow-up, the two got into a heated argument, and shockingly, it was Joey, the soft-spoken, smaller man, who struck first. He landed a single punch, clean, precise, and strong enough to leave JBL dazed with a black eye. One punch. No rematch needed. And from that day on, JBL never messed with Joey Styles again. Booker T versus Batista, when respect matters more than rankings. Back in the mid-2000s, when WWE operated under the Raw versus SmackDown brand split, the rivalry wasn't just on screen. Behind the curtain, tensions ran just as high, and one of the most infamous backstage fights of that era was the clash between two major stars, Booker T and Batista. At the time, Batista was riding the wave of stardom. He had just left SmackDown to join Raw, WWE's so-called flagship show. With his rising fame came a growing ego, and soon, Batista began making comments that rubbed people the wrong way. The most infamous: SmackDown's ratings dropped the moment I left. To those still carrying the blue brand on their backs, that remark was a slap in the face. One man who wasn't going to let it slide was Booker T. And he didn't bother with hints or subtlety. He confronted Batista directly, head-on. What followed was a tense, heated argument, No one backing down, voices rising. Then, without warning or a bell to start it, the fists flew. The fight only lasted about 30 seconds, but that was enough. Despite being known as the animal in the ring, Batista found himself outmatched. Booker T, drawing on experience and pride, made his point loud and clear, in front of plenty of witnesses. Though the two later made peace and even became friends, the incident is still remembered today as a perfect example of an unwritten rule in WWE. You can be a star on television, but backstage, it's respect that keeps you standing. Sin Cara versus Simon Gotch, when a mask couldn't hide the punch. If there's one name in WWE that's become synonymous with backstage brawls, it's Sin Cara. Not because he looks for trouble, but because if someone crosses the line, he's not afraid to settle it with his fists. From Chris Jericho and Sheamus to Simon Gotch, Sin Cara's list of recipients has made people look at his mask with a bit more caution. Among those incidents, the clash with Simon Gotch, one half of the Vaudevillains, stands out the most. It happened right before a SmackDown taping, in a place no one expected, the catering area. Things escalated from a heated exchange, sparked by a sarcastic comment from Gotch, but they spiraled out of control fast. There were no apologies. No one stepped in. Just two men, and one ego that refused to tolerate disrespect. When the argument turned physical, Sin Cara didn't let it drag on. In mere moments, he completely overwhelmed Gotch, who didn't even have time to react. According to witnesses, the fight was quick and entirely one-sided. Gotch had virtually no chance to fight back. With a background in martial arts and street experience, Sin Cara showed he wasn't just a performer in the ring. WWE later required him to attend anger management classes. But for anyone who's crossed paths with him backstage, it's probably best not to say anything that might push the wrong button. Too Cold Scorpio versus Road Warrior Hawk, when egos flared in North Korea. In the long, strange history of backstage fights, nothing tops the surreal clash between Too Cold Scorpio and Road Warrior Hawk, right in the heart of North Korea, during the infamous Collision in Korea event. It wasn't just a wrestling tour, it was a tense, tightly controlled trip where every move was watched, and every word had consequences. And somehow, a brawl still broke out. Scorpio had long held a grudge against wrestling legend Ric Flair, believing Flair had a hand in stalling his career in WCW. So when Scorpio learned Flair was traveling separately, he seized every chance to mock him, insult him publicly, and even curse him out in front of others. But one man wasn't going to let that fly: Road Warrior Hawk. A respected veteran, Hawk confronted Scorpio at their hotel. A few heated words were all it took before the two charged at each other like wild animals. Staff rushed in to break them up, chaos unfolding in a country where even the slightest misstep could lead to real political fallout. The tension didn't stop there. Both men were forced to ride the same bus the next day. And just when things seemed to have calmed down, Hawk snapped, throwing a punch right into Scorpio's face in front of everyone on board. Knowing how dangerous the situation was, Scorpio didn't retaliate. But in his mind, he was already planning revenge, by sharpening a stainless steel chopstick into a makeshift weapon. Fortunately, the payback never happened. And honestly, that's probably something both of them should be grateful for. Eddie Guerrero versus Curt Angle, when friendship catches fire. They were known as one of the most dynamic duos in and out of the ring, but even Eddie Guerrero and Curt Angle weren't immune to backstage flare-ups. In fact, the two close friends nearly came to blows, not once, but twice, in the same night. The incident happened during a SmackDown taping. The storyline called for Curt Angle, alongside Luther Reigns and Mark Jindrak, to ambush Eddie in the ring. Everything went off smoothly, on camera, at least. But the moment they stepped backstage, Eddie exploded. He felt Angle had gone too hard during the segment and genuinely hurt him. And with Eddie's fiery personality, he wasn't about to just let it slide. He confronted Angle on the spot. Things escalated fast. The two started arguing, then shoving. Eddie tried to take Angle down, but this was Curt Angle, an Olympic gold medalist in wrestling. In the blink of an eye, the scuffle turned into a takedown, and Eddie quickly realized he was outmatched. Others jumped in to break it up, but the tension still lingered. Later, Angle approached Eddie in the locker room to apologize. But Eddie, still fuming, shot back coldly, "I'm not ready to forgive you." That was all it took for round two to ignite. They lunged at each other again, this time only stopped when JBL stepped in and pulled them apart. Eventually, both realized it was a heat-of-the-moment misunderstanding. And thankfully, their friendship held strong, right up until the day Eddie left this world far too soon. Roode vs. The Ultimate Warrior. When the curtain falls, the fist rises. In the ring, the Ultimate Warrior and Roode delivered electric, hard-hitting rivalries that thrilled fans. But behind the scenes, things weren't nearly as smooth. What looked like solid chemistry on screen masked real tension backstage. While Warrior had an awe-inspiring physique and unmatched energy, he was widely criticized for lacking technical skill and for being overly aggressive in the ring. In one particularly intense match, Warrior laid into his moves with full force, treating the scripted fight like a real one. Roode ended up absorbing most of those hits, hard. After the match, Roode, never one to complain, approached Warrior calmly. He asked just one thing: go a little lighter next time. But Warrior brushed it off, replying coldly that he wouldn't change anything because that's just my style. That comment, and the disrespect behind it, was the final straw. Roode didn't argue. He just threw a solid punch that dropped Warrior on the spot. In WWE's backstage culture, that was sometimes the only way to send a message. No matter how big of a star you are, respect for your fellow performers isn't optional. Shawn Michaels vs. Marty Jannetty. When friendship shattered under the spotlight. In the early 90s, the Rockers, Shawn Michaels and Marty Jannetty, were seen as the blueprint for a perfect WWE tag team, young, energetic, and in sync. But behind their seamless performances in the ring was a friendship slowly breaking apart, torn by drugs, egos, and unresolved tension. Neither man has ever gone into detail about what caused the fallout, but many insiders from the era agree the cracks had been forming for a long time. Heated words, lack of trust, and professional jealousy were all part of the mix. Eventually, all it took was one spark to ignite an explosion, and it came in the form of a hotel room fight. According to multiple accounts, the unintentional trigger was none other than Roddy Piper. A poorly timed joke set off a full-blown brawl between Shawn and Marty, turning their room into a disaster zone. Things got so out of hand that hotel staff had to call the police. By the time security arrived, both men were cuffed and nearly escorted away. Luckily, Macho Man Randy Savage happened to show up just in time. With his charisma and star power, he convinced the police that it had all been part of a rehearsal for a TV segment. A few autographs later, the two Rockers were let go. But from that moment on, they were never truly a team again. Bret Hart vs. Shawn Michaels. When hatred broke through the screen. By 1997, the relationship between Bret, the Hitman Hart and Shawn Michaels had completely fallen apart. Once respected colleagues, they had become bitter rivals, two unstoppable forces on a collision course, filled with tension and resentment. Things hit a new low after Shawn made a thinly veiled on-air remark about sunny days, a jab that Bret took as a deep personal insult. At the same time, Shawn was dealing with his own personal stress and began using his feud with Bret as a way to let off steam. The situation finally boiled over one day before a taping. Bret was in the bathroom, casually fixing his hair, when he saw Shawn walk by. Bret greeted him calmly. But Shawn snapped back, sharp and cold. "You ignore me for a year and now you want to be friendly?" He stormed off, leaving a thick cloud of tension behind. Bret, never one to let things hang, followed him out and found Shawn lacing his boots. Standing in front of him, Bret asked, "Is there something you want to say?" Shawn stood up and threw a punch, but missed. Bret instantly reacted, grabbing Shawn by the hair and tackling him to the floor. The two locked up in a wild scuffle until Pat Patterson and Jerry Lawler rushed in to separate them. In the chaos, Bret ripped out a chunk of Shawn's hair, a vivid, painful souvenir of a fight fueled by raw emotion. Though both men eventually continued their careers, that moment, when real-life animosity broke through the scripted world, remains one of the most unforgettable chapters in WWE history. Bret Hart vs. Vince McMahon. When trust turned into a punch. No backstage fight in WWE history carries the same emotional weight or iconic status as the punch Bret Hart delivered to Vince McMahon in late 1997, right after the infamous Montreal Screwjob. At the time, Bret was still WWE champion and preparing to leave for WCW under a contract that granted him creative control during his final 30 days. So when Vince asked him to drop the title to Shawn Michaels at Survivor Series, Bret flat out refused, especially since the event was taking place in Montreal, his hometown. After weeks of back and forth, Vince made his move, through deception. During the match, Shawn locked Bret in the sharpshooter, Bret's signature move, and the referee abruptly called for the bell, ending the match even though Bret never tapped out. It all played out live on television, and Bret instantly realized he'd been betrayed. Furious, Bret spit directly in Vince's face, destroyed equipment at ringside, and stormed out of the arena in silence and rage. But that wasn't the end. After cooling off and taking a shower, Bret re-emerged. Without a word, he walked up to Vince and threw a punch square into his face, sending the WWE chairman staggering, leaving him with a black eye and a twisted ankle. Vince limped out of the building, carrying not just physical pain, but the visible mark of betrayal. One punch, but it was the punch of a man whose honor had been shattered. If you find these backstage stories fascinating, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wrestling Sphere, where the truth behind the world of wrestling is told without holding back.